Welcome to my talk. It's about, so smart home devices are very interesting. Oftentimes they'll have like a server they're communicating with. And some fun stuff happens if you can impersonate that server. Very fun stuff in this case. This is a story of how I basically, in order to learn hardware hacking, I took apart a device, gradually reverse engineered it, and found an issue that allowed me to flash new firmware on it. And in the end of the day, as long as I have access to the device, this works without any user interaction whatsoever. Pretty cool, I think. Talk is from light to router, reversing an IoT smart switch. I'm Cameron Howell, and like I mentioned, I'm new to hardware hacking. This was basically the first project I did, kind of learn things, figure it out. Turned out to work out really well, and I think it's very approachable for people. Doesn't necessarily cost too much, so I encourage you to start trying it yourself. I'm going to mention some of the info gathering techniques that I use to basically learn more about the device, some of the information that I found during that, various lessons and failures that I went through, and some useful tools. Because let's just say when soldering on a small device, there's a lot of room to go wrong. Also, this gave me newfound trust issues. Developers lie. The PCB lies. Not nice to figure out. So, starting out, what is the target? My target was this Orvibo A10 smart switch. It has Wi-Fi capability, can integrate with Alexa, it has an app, has a wireless switch. It was super cheap, so I thought, hey, I'm starting out, I want to get something cheap so I don't feel bad when I inevitably break like 4 or 5 of them. So, you know. Before I get into that, I'd like to mention a shortcut that's very helpful. One of my friends ended up telling me about this. It's this FCC ID database. And any device that's basically sold with wireless capabilities, as long as it transmits something, it's required to be registered. And on the product, you can usually see this FCC ID that I outlined in red here. Look that up. It'll give you a bunch of like various external photos, internal photos, like teardowns. That way when you're trying to tear it apart yourself, you kind of know what you should be looking out for before you run things. So in order to tear down this device, as you can see, it's a small box. This is a light switch, so it just connects to your wall, runs on 110 volts. I didn't want to use the that 110 volts to power it. My first time, I was very afraid that I might burn something down, so I just tore it apart immediately. All it took was some guitar picks, some screwdrivers, just had to jam it in there and gradually yank things apart. There were a couple of radio wires there, which the first time I ended up ripping off, but after doing it once, it was easy enough to yank it out without having to worry about that. So what chips is this device running? Well, you wouldn't expect much. It's just a simple light switch. It has some automation. Why is it running so much? Who knows? So it has a A7129. This is a receiver chip for radio, just a radio signal. And it's running at 902.8 megahertz. The issue you'll find if you just look up the chip is that it says it's running at 915, but through fccid.io you can look it up, see that they're actually running it at this frequency, which helps when you're trying to use an SDR to read the signal. So there's also a C90 7B2. This is the chip that just turns the device on and off. Wasn't able to find much information about it, but a cool thing was the device still worked even after I had ripped off the next chip I'm going to list, which is an ESP32C3FN4. This chip was shielded, and on the shield it said like OW32C3. Yeah, so looking that up, obviously no results. But the first thing I decided to do, I decided to take a look at the wireless remote. It's running the A7329. This is the transmit chip that pairs with the other one I mentioned earlier. The signal didn't mean much to me. I used my HackRF and a universal radio hacker to try and decipher it. It should be just a simple command being sent. The remote, bottom left, is very simple. You can see the board. And then the thing in the middle, that's just give it power. It's one of these things that every time you turn it on and off, it self-powers it. But this was one of my first failures. The data didn't mean anything to me. I couldn't decipher it. I looked a bunch of things up. Didn't really go anywhere. So, since I can't do much with that chip, I decided I should look at the ports on the board. What do I have access to? If I power this thing, you can find out that if you connect, like, you test V and the specific pins on the bottom that it's getting power from the little transformer board that's underneath this thing, you can figure out that what the ground pins are, and then you can figure out VCC, which is 3.3 volts because it's an ESP32. Didn't want to use too much, otherwise, I'd burn the thing out, which would not be good. So the left ports, the GTRV right over here, you can see those are actually connected to the C97B2, the chip that turns the thing on and off. I tried measuring them with an oscilloscope. That didn't really give me much of a result. I didn't really see a signal at all. I was kind of at a loss there. But the right ports are also labeled. Mentions WLED boot, SWD clock, SWD IO. And SWD is single wire debug. So it's like JTAG, but you only need 2 connections instead of like 4+. And when I'm not sure quite how to connect to everything, yeah, this kind of makes things easier. I want to take the easiest route I can. I connected SWD clock and SWD IO up to oscilloscope. I noticed some signal there. And yeah, I decided to look closer into that. So now that I know it's a single wire debug, what do? I buy there's cheap J-Link Mini clone. The real J-Link Mini, very expensive if you try to get it, and it's not like the EDU version. I didn't feel like that was necessarily worth it for me, so I just went with a knockoff that worked kind of with OpenOCD. It didn't have any documentation, but when I tested it with the device, didn't really get any information out. Checked multiple configs. I tried to get it configured to work with JTAG, but all of the pins I tried, no luck. I assumed I had a bad connection, kept trying to fix that. Spoiler, it didn't work. So, since I knew that the device might not be that OW32C3 that they mentioned, I wanted to figure out what it actually was running. Turns out one of the Amazon responses on their product page actually mentioned that it was an ESP32. I originally doubted that because it said SWD IO, and the ESP32 doesn't support that. That seemed kind of weird to me, so I tore it off, just used some wire cutters. There was a small like circle there, just kind of chipped at that and gradually yanked it off. I'm surprised this worked without breaking everything. You can actually see on the image right here that there's a tiny little scratch in the top right. Yeah, I kind of hit that with the wire cutters. But it still worked. It still communicated over Wi-Fi. I got lucky there. So what can the ESP32C3 do? It has a USB to JTAG controller, which you can use. There's 2 pins you have to connect to that, a data plus, data minus line. It has GPIO pins for 2 to 3 different UART interfaces. Runs on 3.3 volts. Supports JTAG. And then for the default ESP32 configuration, it will spit out some messages on boot, like specifically what version of the software it's running, anything the vendor has done. There's even like some debug messages for specific variables that are listed. Another nice thing was that there was a lot of documentation for this device. It's basically meant for makers, so there's a lot of resources you can use to figure out how to work with it. Here are some of the links, and I have the pinout, which you probably can't read, but it turns out that the top 2 right pins are the data plus, data minus lines that I'm going to attempt to connect over USB. So, I tried connecting to these pins. The first time I did it by soldering. I just had a normal soldering iron, normal tip, just the standard one that came with the Hako. And I was actually able to connect the wires to the chip on the side there. But one tip that you might want for whenever you're doing this is use some hot glue after you finish soldering it. Otherwise, you might rip it out while you're trying to fix things. As you can see there, there's a small black area between the silver pads and that are the ones I soldered to, and yeah, that's where I ripped the pad off completely. Time for a new wrap. So, I still wanted to map out this chip, kind of figure out how the outside pins go to the inner ESP32. And what I did for that was I had some help, used a hot air gun to remove the subboard there. And the bottom pads, as you can see, they're a lot bigger, there's no risk of me destroying anything there. Well, ideally. But this lets me test the connections and kind of map out which pins I have access to without doing anything funny. Surprisingly enough, after I yanked it off, there's 2 buttons on the side there. That still worked for turning the switch on and off. So you lose Wi-Fi, but if for some reason you still want to use it, yeah, it works. So the next thing I need to do is attempt to talk to this device. I need to get some information out. Need to find something interesting. I'm trying to hack it. I'm not trying to just understand it. I want to make it do something cool. So this is why I have many backups. Thankfully, I had some other test equipment that made things easier. There's these pogo pin connectors called PC Byte makes them. They have like little pogo pin connectors. You can sort of set them up to just gradually place little connections on a circuit without having to solder anything. This is absolutely great for me. I suck at soldering. Anything to avoid it is good. And then along with that, I also used my multimeter for checking connections to things. My flipper 0, I actually used that for UART communication and to power the device. bit of a waste for something so expensive, but you know, I had it, I decided to use it. There's cheaper options like the Bus Pirate, but one thing I noticed with that one was I would get a message that it was having a brownout every once in a while, so it wasn't able to deliver enough power. If you get one of those, make sure to test it, make sure everything, you know, powers properly. So now that I'm retesting pins, what is the pin to get boot messages out? Turns out it's SWDIO. That's not single wire debug, it's just the transmit pin for the boot messages. It's UART 0 on the ESP32. There's more pins available for like JTAG USB. I kind of discounted those because I didn't want to connect to like 5, 6 things at a time. There's pins to change the boot mode. I actually used that to flash the old firmware on it back after I'd exploited it, so I could try it again without having to buy another one, because the firmware I flashed didn't have an update functionality. Not the best idea, but it's what I had available. So I connected it to USB. I was looking for that JTAG again, just because I wanted to get some more information. I wanted to dump the firmware this way. I connected it to this USB adapter, and when I connected that to my computer on Windows, device descriptor not recognized, and Windows gave me no useful information. Yeah, not great. And then I can't even pass it through to anything because Windows doesn't recognize it enough for it to work in a VM or anything, so yeah. But thankfully, like I mentioned earlier, the SWDIO, that was actually the transmit message, the UART. This is where boot logs are being printed to. And one of the things you can see here is that the device is actually running. You can see the Orvibo like variables here. It might be kind of hard to read for those in the back, but has things like the router you're connected to, the password for that router, a bunch of different stuff like that. Useful information, but if you have physical access, like that's not that interesting yet. Want to do this remotely. So in order to get the firmware off it, I was attempting to actually communicate with it, and I assumed that the SWD clock was going to be transmit. It turned out that was connected to the receive pin on the ESP32, but every time I attempted to send anything to it, it just crashed and gave me the guru meditation error. The signal across it was like constant. It was kind of interesting there, so it may have really been a clock. It was kind of slow, so I'm not 100% sure what was going on, but I thought this was kind of cool. So one of the other things that showed up in the boot log messages was actually one command where it lists the download URL for the firmware update. And as you can see, this is being served over HTTP. Not great. You could man in the middle it and try to swap that out, which unfortunately does not work because it does do a small check, not the best check, but it checks the MD5 sum. Really only useful for detecting corruption, but now that I have the firmware, I decided to reverse this, try and find a bit more information here. Maybe I can find something that accepts a command. Maybe I can start executing code on this, something like that, just remotely. And for this, always double check the tech docs. There are a lot of tools for reversing the ESP32, like firmware on it. None of them were useful for me because they changed their architecture. It was using RISC-V IMC. instead of the old version, which used Extensa. All of the old tools were using Extensa. So I wasn't able to get anything interesting out of that there. But with a specific loader, I was able to at least get something. And then another person helped me with actually a conversion script that allowed me to read everything in Ghidra just fine, as long as I set it to RISC-V IMC. And that's kind of hard. So one of the things you can just try is just run strings on it. It actually led me to some interesting locations. There was a bunch of like directory structure for how they built the thing, people's file paths. There was also this tiny CLI module by Chris Wong, and that actually led to a GitHub link that was another piece of Orvibo software that didn't quite help me in this case, but could have been a nice route. So since both of those routes kind of led with nothing, one of the things I wanted to do was I got an ESP32 dev kit, use this to kind of figure out how does this work normally, what am I expecting here, how do I flash stuff to it, how do I read from it, what can I possibly update on this thing. And I set up the ESP32 dev kit as just a man-of-the-middle server. It was my router I connected to, and then through that, I was able to just read all of these messages here. And one of the tools I used was mhex to check like the received data versus the sent data, kind of diff these from each other. And one interesting thing I noticed was there was this 16-byte block that was the same in the middle of some encrypted data. Not exactly something you would expect, but upon researching it a bit more, turns out it was running AES 128 in ECB mode. So another nice mistake there. Gave me an idea of what to look for specifically when I looked at the firmware itself in Ghidra. Once I opened that up, I kind of looked for a large switch case block here. And that's where it was processing all the messages that came from the server. One of the things that happened to help me a lot here was the ESP-IDF has a bunch of strings defined in it. And through that, you can cross-reference those to the firmware image you downloaded and look for the update command. There's an OTA update command that the tech docs mentioned there. Thankfully, that helps a lot. And I noticed that there was a key being referenced inside the data for processing these messages. Well, that key was very nice. It was the encryption key they were using for all initial traffic. And that key is the same for every single device. They do one nice thing. The initial communication is with that key, and then they set it to a dynamic key that the server sends you. But you can go back to that initial key at any time by just pretending you disconnected. So you set up your own server. You got some commands you can send now. Thankfully, there was someone who had already done this for just the off and on functionality of the various Orvibo products. And I modified that, added the key that I found, and used that to find this update command. It was command 76, which gives a URL and the MD5 sum to compare it against. So I modify that to whatever I want for the software that I'm using, and here we go. It was hacked. We turned it into a router. Unfortunately, I was not able to flash it back before the talk here, but I have a video here. So in the top left, we have my fake Orvibo server that's running. This is what's going to be sending the messages to the device. In the middle on the left, I have the HTTP server that's hosting the download. This download is a ESP32 NAT router that I modified a bit. Bottom left, we have DNS mask, so I can take over the domain for it. And you can see it is now in the process of updating on the right. There's a specific counter. It's going up. It reports that back to the server every time. You can see that on the left just going up. Now it's fully updated. ESP32 is starting back up again. And if you'll notice here, we have ESP32 NAT router running on the switch that was originally just meant to turn off and on the lights. So one of the other nice things here is you can actually use this to go back and grab the router's password and the SSID and connect back up to that network and forward that on to yourself outside. It's non-volatile storage. It persists after it flashes. So kind of nice there. Very useful. These slides will be available after, but I listed off some of the tools I used, basically because I think it's nice just to have an idea of everything you need to get started in one place. These are basically the various options I used. You can use something else that's cheaper, but I kind of want to make that available to people. So, what are some important takeaways from this? For attackers, red team, someone looking to get into hardware hacking, you should always take shortcuts. The FCC ID teardowns, that's good, great. Strings, all good. If you're in doubt of anything, skim the tech docs. Reading them fully is good, but personally, I never have enough time for that, so I look for what I need, just skim it. Yeah, and then I test out on like dev boards and stuff. The other thing, use the right tools. If something's gonna make your life easier, just go for it. Soldering can be hard. It'll destroy things if you're as bad as me, so yeah. And for blue team, like defenders, if you're making a device here, one of the things the ESP32 allows is signed images. You can use secure boot on it. You should do that. Just don't let people, flash whatever they want on your device without any interaction. There should at least be some sort of confirmation from the user, if there is. But yeah, another thing, just AES, that's not actually enough. Your keys should be unique. They shouldn't be like the same across every single device. If one person just has to make a small investment, get your key off one device to compromise a whole network of like thousands of these things, that's not great. And then finally, just follow the tech docs. They have recommendations inside them. This one in particular even told you, don't use HTTP for updates. Make sure you actually assign things, and yeah, it's great. And that's my talk. Any questions? Yes.
Did you disclose this or get any bug bounty or anything? Maybe from this company they might not care, but
Yeah, they're kind of. They had a recent big breach that was in the news. Yeah. I did disclose it to them, and they asked for some more details. I provided them, but after that, nothing really. Yeah. So, yes.
Can you flip back to the pictures of the board?
Yeah.
That's obviously a UART.
Yes.
Was there any traffic on that?
Yes. I looked at it. I was trying with just the oscilloscope while I had powered up to see if I saw any signal at all. There was nothing there, at least during the operations I had it doing. So it might be communicating like when the remote was there, but at the time I didn't have that. Yes.
So what are some of the practical implications of what you uncovered in terms of, like, are we talking someone could exploit these en masse?
Yes.
Obviously, you could steal the SSID and the passcodes of some of the networks if you have the system, if you were to steal a piece of these or you bought one used or things like that. But what sort of types of scenarios would you call out as like the top 2 or 3?
Yeah, so if you buy these used, well, your home network information's on it. Another thing that was on it was actually your Orvibo account. So someone could use that to get into your account afterwards. It's a nice one. Turns out some other things in terms of exploiting this, if they ever let their domain lapse, you can basically instantly compromise every single device that checks in at once. That's also another thing that makes this at least a little bit less of an issue is you already have to be able to man-in-the-middle someone to exploit this. Yes?
Do you know how often it checks in for updates and if those updates are on?
Well, I think I recall it checking in for updates basically every time it booted up. I never left it connected long enough to actually see if it keeps doing that afterwards. But if it will lose the connection, it will start trying to initiate that connection with the server again. So you can use that to take down the connection and then restart it. Yeah.
Well, so they basically hard-coded the URL to get their update?
No, the URL wasn't hard-coded in there. That just gets updated every time it has, so it has an update. It will store that last update URL, and through the boot messages, it will show that to you.
So presumably they could have additional updates in the future.
Yes.
To make adjustments and patch.
Yes.
Presumably some of this.
Yes, and they've had, at least last time I looked, they had at least a couple patches every 2-3 months. So things are getting patched. Whether this exact issue is actually patched, I currently don't know. So if you have them, maybe disconnect them from your network.
How long till it runs Doom?
How long till it run? I think there's probably Doom on ESP32 already, so could do it. The interesting thing would be if you could do something funny with the lights, just yeah.
Doesn't throttle power, start fire.
Yeah, I don't think so. In terms of handling power, it won't. At least as far as I know, there's nothing you can do that's dangerous there. More testing is probably good, but definitely a valid thing to worry about. That's a good question. I can post them on my GitHub afterwards. If you saw the email earlier, it's Corvid Aeon. I'll just use that same one. There might be someone at the... Okay, it'll be uploaded as well, yeah. On the YouTube channel.
Do you have any future projects with this specifically, or are we going to move on to the next project for this? Or?
For this device specifically, no. However, one thing I'm currently interested in is there's an IoT telescope. I'm kind of curious what I could do with that.
How would you, if you were behind the software team for this, how would you patch this vulnerability? Do you think it is patchable?
So I think one thing they need to do is they'd have to redesign their backend, because the server that's communicating with it, it assumes that they will be using that same key every time. One of the things I noticed while I was researching this as well was this key has actually been in use since at least 2019. Once I found it, I ended up searching for it, and I found an old, there was a Chinese CTF where they were doing some IoT shit, and they listed it there.
Well, for $12, they Like, that's a lot of work to manage keys.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
issue each one per device and then manage the certificate associated with it and all that.
Yeah, so in that case, since it might not be like financially good to have to manage all of that, one of the other things they can do is just enable secure boot on the device and have a signature there that hopefully they don't release so they don't end up getting compromised. If you don't have the signature, you can't boot the image, and yeah. Thank you.